Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and you and the ranking member for working so carefully with us to get this organized in such a good fashion. Mr. Tillerson, let me first of all just thank you very much for your visit to my office and us being able to exchange ideas and discuss how you want to approach things as the incoming Secretary of State if you're approved. And I want to thank so much your family for being here. It's always wonderful to see family, Brenda and brothers and sisters, and so that's a very good start, I believe. You know, Exxon has done and continues to do business in various countries in the world that are very problematic to the U.S., and you've mentioned that a little bit here. And in some cases, some of those countries are just outright hostile. We now know Exxon did business in Iran, and Iran's regime has supported terrorist attacks against Americans. Exxon has a massive oil interest in Russia, which has recently acted to undermine our elections and civil society. And of course, Exxon also has a history of major political contributions and a large Washington lobbyist presence. Would you permit Exxon to lobby the State Department under your leadership?
Well, Senator, as to any issues involving ExxonMobil that might come before me if confirmed as Secretary of State, I would recuse myself from those issues.
And would you take phone calls from the new CEO about foreign matters or any interests they had around the world that are within jurisdiction of the State Department?
I would not extend to the new chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil any courtesies beyond that which I would extend to anyone.
So are you saying you would take calls and visit with the CEO? I mean, I'm trying to understand here what kind of limits you're going to put on yourself in terms of dealing with your company and employees. I know that you've made a clean break in terms of the ethics agreements and things like that, but give us an understanding of the policy that you're going to follow if you're approved as to how you're going to deal with these situations. I mean, there are many countries, as you know, in the world where, to give you an example, Australia, Equatorial Guinea, Malaysia, Nigeria, Qatar, Russia, and the United Kingdom, Exxon right now is asking for tax dollars back from those. And if you're carrying out foreign policy in those countries, how are you going to deal with that situation in terms of contact with Exxon, with your former colleagues, that kind of situation?
Well, let me start with where you began in terms of taking phone calls. I would not expect that I'll be taking phone calls from any business leaders. In my prior role, I never called on the Secretary of State directly. I called on the deputy often, or the missions, primarily the ambassadors. So whether I'll take phone calls from anyone is a subject to the question itself. As to how I will deal with the past history I have in my prior position with ExxonMobil, I've made clear in my disclosures and I think in answers to questions that have been posed that obviously there's a statutory recusal period which I will adhere to on any matters that might come before the State Department that deal directly and specifically with ExxonMobil. Beyond that, though, in terms of broader issues dealing with the fact that it might involve the oil and natural gas industry itself, the scope of that is such that I would not expect to have to recuse myself. In any instance where there is any question or even the appearance, I would expect to seek the guidance of counsel from the Office of Ethics in the State Department and will follow their guidance as to whether it's an issue that I should recuse myself from.
Yeah, thank you very much for that answer. And I was very heartened by some of the exchange we had in my office with regard to climate change. As you know, climate change has been expressed as a serious national security concern. Sea levels rising threaten Navy bases. We have crop disruption and water shortages all over the world, and in my state of New Mexico, and other natural disasters that I think are going to threaten the stability of many developing countries. During the transition, some departments have been asked to name individuals involved in climate policy who attended international climate meetings, which made many federal employees concerned about a witch hunt against civil servants involved in climate policy. Do you plan or would you support any efforts to persecute, sideline, or otherwise retaliate against career State Department employees who have worked on climate change in the past?
No, sir. That'd be a pretty unhelpful way to get started.
Yeah, well, I like that answer. While you were CEO of Exxon, the company website stated, and I quote here, the risk of climate change is clear and the risk warrants action. Increasing carbon emissions in the atmosphere are having a warming effect. There is a broad scientific and policy consensus that action must be taken to further quantify and assess the risks. And that's the end of the quote on your website. I understand that if confirmed, you will be serving under President-elect Trump, but do you still personally stand by this statement today, yes or no?
I do not take exception to that statement. I might articulate it a little differently as to my personal views. But the President-elect has invited my views on climate change. He's asked for them. He knows that I am on the public record with my views. And I look forward to providing those, if confirmed, to him in discussions around how the U.S. should conduct its policies in this area. Ultimately, the President-elect, he was elected, and I'll carry out his policies in order to be as successful as possible. But I think it's important to note that he has asked, and I feel free to express those views.
Thank you. During our meeting, you expressed support for a carbon tax as one preferred measure to address issues of climate change. Will you continue to work with the Congress on this complex issue and to make this a priority in the State Department if you are confirmed?
Well, when it gets to tax policy, that's going to be the responsibility of other agencies to conduct. My role at State would be only to deal with those issues that are relevant to treaties or international accords that we've entered into in terms of our continued compliance with those, participation in those, and so that would be the area that I'll be most engaged in.
Yeah, and my understanding in the discussion with you in my office, and I think you said you were going to talk about this publicly if you were asked questions, you came to the carbon tax conclusion doing a very thorough analysis of everything that was out there. Whatever was trying to bring down carbon emissions, you looked at everything, and then you concluded the best recommendation was to move forward with a carbon tax. Is that correct?
The analysis that I went through, which was largely informed by a number of studies, economic studies by academic institutions and others, was during the time that the Congress was debating the cap-and-trade approach, which, in my view, had not produced the result that everyone wanted in Europe. So we had a working model in Europe that we had been watching, and ExxonMobil had been participating in that model. The debate around a cap-and-trade as being the option versus something else is what stimulated the question for me of, well, if this isn't working, what might? And so that began the investigation of other alternatives. One of the important elements of even considering something like that as a solution, though, are two other aspects. And one is that it replaces the hodgepodge of approaches we have today, which are scattered, and some of which are through mandates, some of which are through well-intended but ineffective incentives. So let's simplify the system. This is the one and only effort we're going to undertake to begin to try to influence people's choices. And then the second qualifier I've always placed on it is revenues from, if a carbon tax were put in place, it has to be revenue neutral. All the revenues go back out into the economy through either reduced employee payroll taxes, so that because there will be impacts on jobs, so let's mitigate that by reducing the impact by putting it back into the economy. So None of the money is held as in the federal Treasury for other purposes. This is simply a mechanism to incentivize choices people are making. It's not a revenue raiser.
Mr. Tillerson, in your capacity as CEO of ExxonMobil, you praised the Paris Agreement last year, noting that addressing climate change, and I quote, requires broad-based practical solutions around the world. Do you personally believe that the overall national interests of the United States are better served by staying in the Paris Agreement? If so, why? And if not, why not?
As I indicated earlier in a response, I think having a seat at the table to address this issue on a global basis, and it is important that I think it's 190 countries or thereabouts have signed on to begin to take action. I think we're better served by being at that table than leaving that table.
And I think you understand that it's been a generation or more that it's taken to get all the countries at the table to sign an agreement, be willing to move forward with targets, and it would be very unfortunate, I think, to move away from the table. So thank you for your answer there. I just wanted to follow up on a discussion Senator Flake had with you in the first round, urging you to look at the successes of our policy change in Cuba. And this is mainly because you, as a CEO at Exxon, I suspect that you had a low tolerance for old ideas that had failed to produce positive results. Regardless of what one thinks about the Cuban government, no one can argue that the policy of embargo and isolation has achieved any progress. The proof is right in front of us. The Castro regime endures. And I'm a strong supporter of the policy of re-engagement, which has already produced results. And, you know, you mentioned you're going to do a bottoms-up review. In thinking about that bottoms-up review, I would just point out that these things that I'm going to mention have happened and are very positive. First of all, we've worked with the Cubans to combat diseases such as Zika, diabetes, and a multinational effort to combat Ebola in Africa. Efforts to increase access to the internet have paid off with new Wi-Fi hotspots in Havana and increased efforts to bring improved cellular access to the island, including roaming deals with U.S. carriers. Increased bilateral business activity supported by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Hispano Chamber of Commerce. And last week, the United States and Cuba signed a bilateral agreement to prepare for and respond to oil spills and hazardous substance pollution in the Gulf of Mexico and the Straits of Florida. Our new policy towards Cuba, according to a 2015 Pew Research poll, shows that 72% of Americans support the renewed diplomatic relations and 73% support ending the embargo. I doubt that there are many issues where such a vast majority of the American people agree, and I hope we will not be letting those Americans down by returning to a period where such efforts are made impossible by a failed policy that showed no results. Instead, I hope you will continue to work to support the Cuban small business owner, almost 500,000 licensed businesses and growing, and to continue the engagement which has led to increased opportunities for both Cuban and American businesses in Cuba. Will you recommend to President-elect Trump a policy of engagement with Cuba in order to foster the change that is needed on the island? Or do you prefer to go back to the old policy of the past 50 years that failed to bring real change or undermine the Castro regime?
Well, Senator, again, if confirmed, the job of the diplomat is to engage. And so engagement is always preferred, and our door is always open to want to engage to affect change. But I think we have to be honest with ourselves about the engagement with Cuba. There are longstanding statutes in place that govern that relationship. The Helms-Burton Amendment, the designated list of state sponsors of terrorism, and there are specific criteria around whether we and organizations and those who are conducting affairs in Cuba are in compliance with those statutory requirements. So if if we are able to engage in a positive way and still meet all of the compliance of those statutes, then that's a good thing. I don't know because I've not had the opportunity to have a fulsome examination, as I said earlier, of what changed. Because there's a lot of activity that's been enabled, and obviously someone had to make a determination that something changed. Did it in fact change? I'd like to see all of the documentation, the information around that. Otherwise, if we're going to change the relationship, we've got to change those statutes as well. So I'm, again, kind of this common theme maybe you're hearing from me is I believe we live up to the agreements and we live up to the laws and we fully enforce them. They were put there for a reason. If circumstances change, then we need to change our posture on those as well. But that's the reason I think it demands a bottoms-up review, because a lot of things have been changed in the recent past here, much of it by executive order, and I think the President-elect has indicated he'd really like to understand all of that. What was the criteria that the State Department used to make its determinations? That's what he's going to be asking me.
Yeah. Well, the reason I cited those polls is I think the American people are at the point of wanting those statutes to be set aside, and I quoted one, and so I don't want to argue with you, but I very much appreciate your answers in terms of consulting State Department people, and I can't think of better professionals than these State Department professionals that spend decades learning about the regions that they serve in, the specific countries they work on, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness in terms of doing that. And just a final question here is Senator Menendez mentioned the whole issue of fugitives. We also have a fugitive by the name of Charlie Hill, who's I believe should be brought to justice. And I really believe that we have a better chance at getting him out. We're already having discussions if we engage with them rather than going back to a policy of isolation. So with that, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.